Are you finding yourself smoking cigarettes without knowing why? Or spending hours playing games that make no sense like Flappy Bird and yet being unable to stop? Or maybe you're eating too much junk food. In this episode, I'm going to talk a bit about dopamine fixers and how they hardwire us to perform bad habits over and over again, and what we can do to eliminate them from our lives. So stay tuned. Alright, so all of us have had some bad habit or another throughout our lives, and most of us have them to some degree still. Whether it's smoking, or too much caffeine, or other drugs, or TV, or playing too many of those little addictive games, or perhaps junk food. There's so many of these bad habits that we take up in our lives, and most of these things in moderation aren't that negative, but the moment that it starts getting more than in moderation, you start getting problems. And the other problem is that we often overlay all of these different bad habits on top of each other, so what was previously moderation and okay is now a whole host of bad habits, all detracting from your health, your well-being, and what you're doing each day. So, how do these habits form? What forms a habit? Well, for starters, we need to go back in time a bit to when humans were living isolated lives as hunter-gatherers, not relying on society to provide for them, but relying on their own instincts, their own abilities. In that day and age, you had to be responsive and adaptive to new situations. And so the human had to be able to learn new things, and it had to know to repeat these things when they were beneficial to it in some way. So the way the brain does this is certain activities that are correlated with better survival, like eating, reproduction, and exercise, or eliminating a threat that was about to eat you, that kind of thing. All of these activities, our brain, responding to those activities, would release dopamine. And dopamine essentially gives you a flood of energy, it gives you euphoria, you feel good about yourself. But what it also does is it tells your brain that you just succeeded in some way, you've done something good. It's like when you give your dog a little treat after it's done a trick. When dopamine is released, it gives your brain a little treat saying that you've done a trick, basically. And so when the caveman was running around and he hunted down his meal, he'd get a lot of dopamine for that, so he'd know that the things he's doing hunting are working and to repeat those behaviors. And then he'd eat it and he'd get some more, and he'd know, he was getting rewarded for good work. But this doesn't carry over to modern day society. You see, we haven't evolved all that much since that time, and we're still relying on this primitive way that our brain works. So, essentially, we're in a consumer society where there are so many instant hit dopamine rushes available from all sorts of things that we start to take these things up, and our brain reacts to them the same way as if we just hunted down an animal and got our dinner for the day. It says, oh look, there's dopamine, that's the thing that comes around when I've done something really good. This is for my survival, I need to hardwire this activity into my brain. So let's look at things that give you a rush of dopamine. Well, listening to good music, for one. That's not necessarily a bad habit though. But smoking. Smoking gives you a dopamine rush, as do most recreational drugs out there. Sex or masturbation both give you a dopamine rush, which in moderation is good, in excess causes addiction to those things. Then you get video games as well. We all know video games are great in moderation, but some people find themselves addicted to the most silly games, the games that they don't understand why they're addicted to them. Games like Flappy Bird, where you're just doing a repetitive action over and over and over again, and yet somehow they can't stop playing it. Why is that? Well, this is something fascinating. if you've ever seen one of those games like Cookie Clicker, where your objective is just to keep clicking and your points go up, nothing else really, there's not much more complexity to it. Well, what they've learned in the game industry is that we actually respond to seeing any sort of progress. Any sort of progress seems to reward us with a dopamine rush. So if we see a number going up on the screen every time we click, and we know that, our number might get higher than our friend's number if we keep clicking, then our brain says we have to keep clicking. Even if it's just a number, if you were just on a white screen, a blank white screen, and you just saw a number go up every time you clicked, you would actually get more of a dopamine rush from that than from some really fun and well-developed game. And this is why you see all these little mini games on your phone and that, because people know that keeping it simple and just making your score go up and making you do something repetitive over and over sends off constant fixes of dopamine to your brain. Now the problem with this is that every time dopamine fires off in your brain, you've hardwired the activity that you've been doing into the brain as a habit more and more. So, every click, you're putting it more into your brain that you want to keep playing that game. You want to keep playing that game. So this is why people get hopelessly addicted to some of these things. We joke about it because we see people saying that they're addicted to some of these things, and we think, no, that's not possible. Why would you be addicted to something like that? It's just a simple game where your score goes up. But the fact is, people do get addicted because that's how habits form. Habits form through dopamine and the reward circuits. And when dopamine fires off, the reward circuits start to build up a habit. So, why I'm bringing this up is we expose ourselves to these stimuli a lot of the time when we really shouldn't. Because the minute that you've exposed yourself to one of these stimuli once, you've already built up more of a desire to go back to it simply because of the dopamine firing off. So say you just play one of these cookie clicker type games just for the hell of it. Well, at the time you're willing to do it just for the hell of it, but after you've played a few minutes or whatever, now it's not just for the hell of it. Now you actually want to play because of the dopamine stimuli. You've become stimulated. You're actually getting somewhat of a euphoria from the experience, and you might not realize it, but it's happening, and it's something that we don't notice because it's happening all of the time in our culture. It's the same like if you go and you eat some fast food. That fast food isn't healthy, it isn't helping your survival, but because of all the sugar and the artificial sweeteners and all of the other rubbish that's in the food, you're getting a dopamine rush, because a lot of that stuff is specifically engineered to give you that rush of sugar, of dopamine, of all these things, so that your brain hardwires that you want more, because that sells more. You can't sell as many carrots as you can sell, burgers, because people are more readily drawn to the things that they've built up a habit around, and you build up habits around dopamine release. So you have to be mindful of what things you're allowing into your life in the first place, because people have this idea of habits as all being a willpower based thing. Like if you've got strong willpower, you don't build up a habit. But what happens is all habits are something that hardwires in the brain. It just happens. The minute that dopamine is released, you start to wire in that habit. So yes, there's a certain amount of willpower involved in ending a habit once it's there, but the habit will form regardless of what your level of willpower is after a certain amount of exposure to the stimuli. So if you're exposing yourself to, playing lots and lots of mindless mini games that don't have any point and are just, stat increase and you getting those little dopamine fixes, then you're going to keep playing them. You're going to want to keep playing them, and when you don't play them, you're going to feel annoyed because your brain is looking at its reward circuits and it's seeing that this is a survival mechanism. It's wired it in like it's a survival mechanism, so it's telling you have to go back and do that, otherwise your survival is at stake. And this is why our habits are so ingrained into us, because our brain treats them as ways that we need to keep doing things if we want to survive. So then, how do we actually break these habits when they form? Well, the simple thing about dopamine and reward circuits is that the reward circuits and the habits themselves, basically, the more dopamine fires off, the stronger the habit. But over time, with absence from the habit in question, it'll start to be unlearned. In other words, the desire for the stimuli will go down and you'll start to feel less of a pull towards it, and at that point you just have to keep away from it, and eventually the habit will be unlearned, at least most of the way unlearned. Of course, it's still going to be there as a habit more than something that you've never done before or whatever, but it's not going to bother you, it's not going to cause problems. And the issue with this is that when people are doing too much of something like junk food, or they're smoking too many cigarettes or whatever, they usually try to do it in a manner of, hey, I'll cut down, but they keep their use regular. So if you're eating junk food every day and you cut the amount that you're eating in half, yes, you're cutting down somewhat the overall dopamine fixes that you're getting from that fast food, but because of the frequency of those fixes, the habit stays ingrained. What you need to do if you want to stop eating so much junk food is absolutely force yourself to just not eat any junk food for a few weeks, and then only on occasion from that point on. You need to take a longish break to get rid of the reward circuits that are already there, that are already built up around the habit. And this is hard, and this is the bit that takes willpower. But it's the only way to truly rid yourself of a habit. And before I get done with this video, I want to expose something that is one of the ways that we're most affected by this all of the time. And that's on the internet. Have you ever seen those clickbait titles that you get on articles, on videos and everything? It'll be like, you won't believe this one amazing prank in the hood gone sexual. Something like that. And you click it just because you're like curious. It's like, you know that the video is actually probably going to be shit, but you click it because you're curious. And unfortunately, this is just the way marketing works. If you want to get people to click your content, you have to make something that spurs that curiosity. And I think it's okay as long as you're doing it in a way that applies to what your content is and that, but the thing about it is we're automatically almost programmed to respond to those kind of things. And so when we see clickbait type titles, like, none of us want to admit that we click on those things, but we do. We click on things that entice us. And this is why we spend an awful lot of time procrastinating half the time, because, maybe you're at home and you're supposed to be doing homework, or you're supposed to be doing some extra overtime for work or whatever, and you've gone on the internet to check your email, and you see some article title there and you're like, what's this? I'll just check it out. And you go there, and then on that website they've got like 20 more clickbait titles in the side, and you just go through a bunch of them, and before you know it, you've gone through like an hour just looking at completely meaningless bullshit, and you haven't gained anything from it. You've just wasted time, but also you've been getting those dopamine fixes every time you've clicked, because essentially those articles are there to spur that curiosity so that our dopamine starts firing off when we click it, when we see some little juicy tidbit of information, when we see a juicy looking title, and so we do that more and more. And this is true for the way all media works. This is why advertising engages your senses and stuff, and engages your kind of primal inner desires, because it's there to get your dopamine building up reward circuits around what you are supposed to do according to the advertisers, what they want you to buy, what they want you to do, how they want you to feel about the product, all that. That'll all be built into your brain by the way they stimulate you. So the best thing you can do is limit your exposure to these things. And although a lot of people won't like to hear it, I would recommend spending less time on places like Facebook, especially because Facebook is just full of all of this clickbait and all of those little games that just are there for dopamine fixes, all of this rubbish. And in reality, if you want to have an account just so you can keep in contact with certain people, then have the account. Just don't log into it unless you need to specifically contact someone. And if you do, don't be scrolling down the feed all the time. Same goes for places like Twitter and that. Use it properly. Don't just scroll through a million tweets reading and letting those dopamine fixes kick in every time you see a nugget of information. And, you know, don't get hooked into those little mini games, you know, that don't have any point. If you're wanting to spend your time recreationally, then, you know, pick a game that's got some depth to it, something that's not just instant dopamine fixes from the constant progression. And just be mindful in general of what you're exposing yourself to. And a good thing that you can do is look at these activities that you do in your life and look at what you do that you kind of know is pointless, but you do it anyway because, like, you start doing it and then you just do more and more. Those activities tend to be things associated with dopamine release, because that's basically how dopamine release works. You do the activity maybe just because you're bored, and then once you start doing it, the dopamine fires off, and the dopamine is essentially something that makes you feel euphoric, it makes you feel good. And so at that point, you do a bit more. And then at that point, you're starting to wire in a habit, so you start to do more out of habit. And, you know, that's how you get carried away and lose hours of your day. So anyway, that's been a bit about dopamine fixes, what they are, why you should avoid them, how you can avoid them, and hopefully this has been helpful to some of you guys. I hope you'll be careful about what you're exposing yourselves to, and be mindful to keep things in moderation, and just watch out for these ways that the media will trick you into clicking and wasting your time and stuff. So I hope you've liked the video. If you did, remember to subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, leave a comment below letting me know your thoughts, and share it with your friends.